Right, in this next segment of our newscast, we share with you the thoughts of one scholar with regard to the latest developments, diplomatic developments that will be here in South Korea. I have Professor Hans Schattle of Political Science at Yonsei University here in the studio. Professor Schattle, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
So nice to see you too, Sunny. Thank you for having me this evening.
Right, Professor, before we delve into the Apec leaders meeting, which ended earlier on this Saturday in the historic city of Gyeongju, I'd like to take your attention to the summit between President Lee Jae Myung and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping that took place right after that particular summit. What do you believe first is the significance of this particular summit?
Right, this is the breaking news, so to speak, today. It's the story of the day, and it was certainly very important because this is the first time that Xi Jinping and Lee Jae Myung have had a chance to sit down in person since President Lee took office earlier this year. And they had quite a bit of catching up to do, I think. President Lee said very interestingly, I thought, after the summit and also during his press conference, that the relationship between South Korea and China is complex, and that there's a mix of collaboration and also confrontation in the relationship. And for the most part, we heard niceties from the two leaders when they were talking together, but I thought that emphasis that Lee Jae Myung presented, that the relationship does have its challenges, that is really saying something. And I imagine that behind the scenes, when the two of them were talking, they had the chance to hash out, so to speak, some of those difficult issues. I think when Lee Jae Myung says confrontation, he's talking about diplomatic confrontation, taking up difficult issues and facing them. For one, earlier this week, after the U.S. and South Korea announced that they would work together, possibly to set the stage for South Korea to have its own nuclear submarine, China put out a rather chilly statement on that, a cautious statement about that. Not a word was said in the press conferences between Xi and Yi, but I suspect that behind the scenes they were talking about that and what that might mean for non-proliferation. I think China will be concerned about maintaining the norms when it comes to non-proliferation of nuclear weapons and what a nuclear submarine for South Korea might mean. And then from South Korea's point of view, there's been a lot of concern over the past week about maritime structures that China has been building in the West Sea. Again, we didn't hear much about that in the press conference today. We heard, again, buzzwords such as regional development, cooperation, and peace and stability, but I suspect that was something they were also probably talking about behind the scenes. And then lastly, there's always the issue of North Korea. North Korea did not meet with President Trump from the U.S. That's obvious now. North Korea was testing missiles at the time the world leaders were descending on Gyeongju just this morning. As the report indicated earlier, North Korea is now making the statement that denuclearization would be silly as an objective. So that's sending a message really to everybody. That's not just sending a message to Lee Jae Myung or to Donald Trump. That's North Korea sending a message to the region that it really wants to be recognized as part of the nuclear club. And I would think that Xi Jinping and Lee Jae Myung today probably talked a bit about how to deal with that. And as President Lee also said in his comments, what China might be able to do to facilitate further dialogue, although the specifics of that still remain very unclear.
What are your thoughts with regard to ties between Seoul and Beijing going forward, especially keeping in mind the dramatic shift, if you will, with regard to geopolitics amid the presence of the second Trump leadership?
Right, they're very important, especially economically. I think that right now, and I imagine we saw quite a bit of this at Apec, right? We have 21 countries there from both sides of the Pacific. The countries are fairly large in themselves, China being the largest of all. Of course, China and South Korea typically are the top trading partners. At least for South Korea, China is the top trading partner. So there's a lot of stakes here. And I think that's the good thing. APEC was an opportunity, I think, for the world leaders maybe to kind of pivot away from the earlier emphasis that we used to see at APEC, say, 20 to 30 years ago, on heavy industry and manufacturing. And today we saw in the declaration coming out that the emphasis is more on cultural and creative industries. and the emphasis is on AI. And that's a point where there seems, so far anyway, there seems to be a little bit less friction. There seems to be an interest in trying to bring together potential competitors and figure out what to do with this wondrous but also scary, I suppose, new technology that we're facing, to try to harness benefits that go with AI without displacing human beings and without creating new kinds of platforms or systems that could actually be threatening to human beings going forward on this planet, really all life on the planet. So I don't think the leaders at APEC sorted that out, but now that they're talking about continued cooperation, they've at least set the stage for further collaboration in future APEC summits to try to have a kind of multilateral platform to sort that out. So the takeaway from APEC this time around was much less about conventional trade. In fact, there was less language in the overall takeaway about the World Trade Organization as well as a framework for APEC. I think at the Trump administration's urging that was excluded from the document, but the Trump people did sign on to that. So we instead see this emphasis on things like culture, AI, demographic change, and that's a kind of interesting move. And it also tells us that China, being front and center of this, that China really now is emerging in its own right as a high-tech, high-skilled economy ready to play ball, so to speak, in these areas with the other Asian tigers. That was also not the case, say, when APEC got its start a generation ago. So it's very interesting to see that progression.
Keeping that in mind, Professor Schattle, do you suppose there might be closer regional partnership among the three countries? I'm speaking about South Korea, China, and Japan. And if that is the case, what areas might this trilateral partnership see productive results? Yeah,
that's an extremely intriguing question. And we're looking at that all around the world, basically whether it's Europe or Latin America or even Africa or now Asia. As the U.S. becomes a more confrontational country to deal with, as President Trump basically has introduced elements of uncertainty and complications and risk and cost with, trade and demands for investment, allies of the U.S., in a sense, allies and even neutral countries or even adversaries, maybe like China. So many different players around the world are trying to figure out what constellations can be put together to regroup and try to kind of foster collaboration, but also working around what could be difficult relations with the U.S. So trilateral with China, Japan, and South Korea, that's been something that we've been talking about for about 20 years here. It hasn't really moved forward in 20 years. I remember when I got to Seoul in 2008, when I was starting to teach at Yonsei, there was a lot of interest in East Asian regional community building back then, and then of course the relations actually became a little bit more confrontational. But now, at least at this APEC summit, we didn't see that. Now what we did not see at APEC was a trilateral meeting with China, Japan, and South Korea. Everything was still very much bilateral. And I would also emphasize that despite the uncertainty that Trump brings, that Japan, South Korea, and the U.S. are still in a trilateral relationship, security-wise, that was started with the Biden presidency. That remains in place for all the earthquakes that Trump has brought to international relations. The overall U.S. alliances with Japan and South Korea are still intact. The trilateral with the U.S., Japan, and South Korea are all still intact. And I don't think they're going away either, not for the short term anyway. You never know what will happen in the long term. So any trilateral that's going to involve Japan, South Korea, and China is going to have to kind of work around that other trilateral that South Korea and Japan are involved with. And also, South Korea and China, and now Japan and China, for a long time Japan and China, have had their own maritime issues with China. So those will have to be sorted out for a trilateral really to take shape. But just picking up one more point from your question, as for Xi Jinping's sentiments on this, he seems all for greater regional integration this time around. His speech at APEC was all about multilateralism and economic liberalization. Kind of interesting to hear these kinds of statements from a communist leader, right, of the CCP. You don't usually hear talk about global economic integration, capitalist style world economics from the leader of China. But he's very clearly going in that direction at this summit. And I think he's eager to figure out what else could happen with East Asia. Possibly, he's getting ready to host APEC next year in Shenzhen. They've now announced the location. And I would imagine that he'll be trying to pick up on where he left off in his speech next year And at that meeting next year, trying to cultivate more of an image of China as a power center that other East Asian countries can gather around. And we've not necessarily seen that in East Asia over the decades. Typically, we see a lot of the East Asian democracies or the more advanced economy really going more in the direction of the US. So we'll have to see what kind of world order or regional order, more to the point, is brought about over the next couple of years with a lot of factors, with APEC part of the mix there.
And with regard to the US's direction under the Trump administration, Mr. Trump chose to miss the main APEC leaders meeting. Now, given that reality, quite a number of pundits have been speaking about the possibility of other nations perhaps stepping in to fill in the leadership vacuum left by the Trump administration. That being said, Professor Schattle, which APEC members might be looking perhaps to fill that leadership vacuum, do you think?
I think to an extent just about everybody, and everybody is looking for network partners in a sense. I mean, there's a leadership vacuum. So, well, is there really a leadership vacuum? That's the tricky thing. I mean, in 2018 and 2019, during the first Trump presidency, APEC didn't even get declarations together in full form. So in a way, even though the second Trump presidency at face value might look a whole lot more disruptive than the first, they actually got their statement together this time. Maybe that's because also the leaders on this side were willing to write out and compromise on some of the language on multilateralism. So the declaration's a bit weaker than maybe some countries would have wanted, but the US did sign on to something, and that's a consensus agreement that signs the declaration. So in that sense, whether it's a vacuum or whether it's just a more minimal role for APEC to play, that the Trump people came, they were, Trump's deputies were still here for the summit, even if the president himself moved on. And I realize also that Trump has a government shutdown to deal with in the US, and he was taking heat in the US for flying to Asia too. So national leaders always have a lot of considerations about how long they'll be away. But yes, the president wasn't here for the whole time, and that was a little bit symbolic. Maybe very symbolic. Nevertheless, I do think that China is interested, especially since they're hosting next year. That's their chance to try to put a stamp on the summit the same way that Lee Jae Myung did this year in Gyeongju, with that shift again toward more high-tech industries and creative industries and so forth. But you can take countries like Australia, Singapore, which of course started APEC, Malaysia. These are often like middle power countries that are looking for ways to find network partners in the security realm as well as in the economic realm. And they're also interested in having smaller countries like Vietnam or even the Philippines, which is another middle-sized country. I think Philippines had a lot of domestic interest in this. Again, Malaysia, Chile and Peru, also Mexico. So Canada is also a country to watch. They were here this time talking about security and defense arrangements, even a submarine plan with the Koreans, with Hanwha involved. Not a nuclear submarine. Canada's not quite that ambitious yet. But they too are looking, with all the tensions that Canada's having with the US right now, even just leading up to the summit in the past week involving trade there, they too are looking for players in this part of the world. And Lee Jae Myung, it didn't get as much attention, but he had a summit with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney that was also aimed not just on the economic side of cooperation, but on the security side of cooperation as well.
Right.
So APEC is really kind of one of those cross-cutting gatherings where you have countries working out two-way arrangements, but also working collaboratively as a larger unit.
And speaking about the APEC again, Professor Schattle, if I were to ask you to give a score to South Korea's hosting of this year's event out of 10, what would your score be? Well,
I wasn't there, so I can't say firsthand, but I would, from what I saw on television and what I've been reading with the rest of you, I'd say definitely an A for effort at the very least, which would, numerically, that would be like a 9.5 out of 10. I think Lee Jae Myung, who, it's hard to remember that not so long ago he was just the mayor of Songnam or the governor of Gyeongju. But I think a lot of the executive experience and maybe some of the domestic diplomacy that he had to deal with all these years, even though he had a reputation as more of a tough and abrasive guy, diplomatically dealing with fairly tough world leaders like Xi and Trump, he does seem to know how to handle them. Seems the logistics of the summit in Gyeongju went very smoothly. and also the care that went into some of the menus for the state dinners and the words that were spoken. Lee Jae Myung saying today that he hopes that the Shenzhen meeting next year goes even better than this year's meeting in Gyeongju. So that's giving a lot to Xi Jinping. I will say, with kind of mixed feelings, that no country seems to be trying to flatter Trump in the U.S. in the way that South Korea has done. A lot of mixed reaction on President Lee handing President Trump a golden crown just a few days after the No Kings protests in the U.S. Even some late-night talk show hosts in the U.S. doing satirical news begging South Korea not to try to crown the president a king, that he's got enough ambitions, it seems, so far to be imperial. How can South Korea filter that along? Or some Americans are also saying, let him be the king of South Korea if he wants to be a king. You can have him, you can keep him. So there was a lot of skepticism or criticism or joking on that. Is South Korea both flattering and trolling at the same time? So it certainly got the summit a whole lot more attention than it normally might have had back in the U.S. and maybe even a lot of other countries. But again, that kind of speaks to the world that we are in. I mean, APEC is a multilateral organization, but a lot of the more serious, and certainly the economic aspects are important, but a lot of the more serious business this time around was with several different high-stakes bilateral meetings. And that was also a lot for South Korea to host and organize, and the logistics of all of it. And it seems to have come and gone very quickly in a whirlwind.
Professor Schattle, one final question before we let you go, and a brief answer if possible, because we have about 30 seconds left. Like you mentioned earlier, China is hosting next year's APEC leaders meeting. What should we be keeping our eyes on?
Well, I think for one, will Xi Jinping pick up on that economic integration theme that he brought forward earlier in his speech? Second, will China try to cultivate a little bit more soft power? Soft power, power through appeal or likability, that's not been a strong suit for China over the years. It's not currently a strong suit for the U.S. Trump is, many in the U.S. fear, is wasting away a lot of American soft power, maybe squandering it. So does she have an opening on that front? And then lastly, I didn't see enough on the environment at this summit. And I am wondering if green energy, something that China is investing very heavily in right now, will that be more of a theme at APEC next year than it was this year?
All right, definitely something to look forward to. Professor Schattle, thank you so much for your thought-provoking insights.
Thanks so much, Sunny, for having me.